What are the implications for the Emergencies Act going forward in future governments if all that's required is for somebody somewhere to feel psychologically violated, or there's some sort of psychological violence?
It's almost thought crime, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very dark road to go down, flimsy basis on which to invoke a national emergency.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Well, if you were going to coin a term that would describe the way that the Freedom Convoy of 2022 was broken up by government, it might be Unjustified. And today on the show, we have a return guest, Ray McGinnis, who's written really, I think, the best book so far on the convoy, and I've read several. It's the most in-depth, I think, portrayal of it and explanation of it. And so he's here to talk about it. So thanks for coming back on the show, Ray. It's great to have you on.
Great to be with you, Leighton. I'm happy to see you again.
Right. So Ray is, we're going to introduce him properly. He's a fellow, I guess, a fellow of the Frontier Center, as am I. So it's great to have my brother, so to speak, on the show. But in terms of our framing aphorisms, we're going to do something a little bit different today, because I want to share with you some things that people you probably have heard of are saying about this book. The first one is from Tamara Leach, who says, Unjustified is one of the most important books of our time. Ray does a deep dive into the false narratives created and perpetuated by Canada's ruling Liberal Party in partnership with the legacy media, and shows how the judiciary system is being weaponized against everyday Canadian citizens who voice their concerns. She says it's a must-read for anyone seeking the jaw-dropping truth around the Freedom Convoy, the POEC, and the ongoing persecution of Canadian political prisoners. Well, if that weren't enough, how about this from the Honourable Brian Peckford, the last living signatory to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is kind of at the core of this book and a discussion of it. He says, here's Ray McGinnis to the rescue. In a fast-paced yet methodical manner, Ray sifts through the political spin and facts and exposes the falsity of the Canadian federal government's invocation of the Emergencies Act to quell a fictitious national emergency supposedly created by a peaceful truckers' protest. Love the way Brian turns a phrase. And next, from famous Canadian journalist Trish Wood, who's an award-winning investigative journalist with CBC's The Fifth Estate. And as it happens, she says McGinnis has crafted the ultimate expose on the West campaign against dissent. With careful reporting, he blows up the false propaganda narrative that the trucker convoy was dangerous, but he also reveals a whitewash cleanup by the POEC on behalf of the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act against peaceful protesters. So a little bit of a note about the author. He's been on the show before, but Ray is the author of Unanswered Questions, What the September 11th Families Asked and the 9/11 Commission Ignored, and Writing the Sacred. That's a poem-inspired path to writing and appreciating sacred poetry. If you want to know more about those books, you should check out an earlier episode that Ray was on of the show, where we talked about those books, especially the 9/11 book, in depth. Ray attended the Public Order Emergency Commission, the POEC, hearings in mid-November, and heard over a dozen witnesses testify in person. Subsequently, he watched or read through the testimony of all 76 witnesses. I'm not sure anybody else has done that in as comprehensive a way as Ray has done here. He also attended several days of the trial of Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, which seems to be endless and is ongoing. And as I said, he's a senior fellow at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. He lives in Vancouver, Canada. So, Ray, I want to start with maybe the easy question. Of all the things that you could write about, and we know you write on a wide variety of topics, what inspired you to write this book on this particular topic? Obviously a huge endeavor, massive amounts of research. What drew you to this as a topic for your latest book?
Yeah, thank you, Leighton. I had been writing articles. Now, I'm not a journalist as a profession, although people might say I'm doing some great journalistic work as an independent citizen. But, I mean, I had been, teaching writing workshops and doing other things for decades before then. But the Emergencies Act invocation on February 14th, 2022, prompted me then to quickly write my first article about what I thought about what was happening on a website in the States called Dissident Voice, which I didn't know, but they accepted my article. So over the following year, I published over maybe a dozen different articles in different platforms in North America and Europe, and was, interviewed on podcasts in, Canada, the US, Portugal, France, UK. And I was just fine writing my articles. Some of them were deep dive articles on the report. I published a long piece, 7,000 words or so, on Covert Action magazine, which I would call a progressive left website out of Washington, D.C. But they took the article, and I got a lot of response and ended up on about 6 or 8 podcasts in March of 2023. And all of that prompted me to be urged by quite a few people to not simply keep publishing short or long articles on different platforms, but to actually write a book and pull together what I was writing. And I was encouraged to also start writing about what was happening with the Coots 4. And I actually ended up going for a couple of days to the trial of the Coots 2 in Lethbridge in mid-July of 2024. And I realized too, in terms of the people requesting me to write a book, there's so much information that comes at us all the time, and maybe some of your listeners, viewers, like me, can paste and copy different articles on a site and put it into a Word document and keep acquiring 20, 50, 75 articles on a given topic. But after a while, we start to, forget, what we've even learned, because there's so much that's coming at us in real time every day. So I think the value of a book is that I can gather together some information. And although I probably could have written a book twice the length, but then it wouldn't have sold as well because it's that much more pricey. But I can put together a book that has nearly 400 footnotes, and people can see the references. They can go to the articles. They can go to the documents from the Public Order Emergency Commission. They can scroll down and see what I'm quoting from what CSIS Director David Vigneault or anyone else said on the stand, and then they can see that I've got the receipts for the paper trail that I document to support the book.
Well, I didn't have the honor of writing a foreword to your book, and you're going to have to send me a note of apology on that. I'm just kidding, but I will say the 3 things that I noticed about your book, and I really enjoyed it. Number 1, the table of contents really is helpful. It really is useful, the way you've structured all this. As you say, there's so much information, so much has been written and seen in Canada about the Freedom Convoy. I just found the table of contents really set things out in a way that was really put things together nicely and made sense of it. Secondly, copiously documented, as you've said. Everything that you say, this is not a book where Ray just goes off on a flight of fancy and gives us his opinion about the Freedom Convoy. This thing is carefully, very, very well documented. It reads like history, but which is not to say he doesn't provide his own thoughts at certain times about things, but very, very carefully documented. And thirdly, with everything that I've written of yours, Ray, it's beautifully written. It's very, very readable prose. And it's not written, let's just say it's not Maps of Meaning by Jordan Peterson. It's very, very digestible to people. I would think, not to say that this is lowbrow, by any stretch, but certainly it's written in a voice that I think will speak to every Canadian who lived through this, and many of whom maybe didn't and don't understand things as well as you do. So bravo. I would say that this is the best book that I have yet read on the Freedom Convoy. I want to start off with this, Ray, in that I have kind of a, like many people, personal connection to the convoy and to the Emergencies Act, because I went through a cancel culture experience back in early part of 2020, because I published something online saying that I thought that the Liberals were monkeying around with the Emergencies Act legislation and that they were going to use COVID as a pretext. And that drew all the Valkyries down on me. I had, Mr. Farber and other people and the employee of the Liberal Party of Canada coming down to me. So I have a personal connection to this book. But I want to start off with this, actually, because in the book, you quote from Jody Wilson-Raybould's book. And I want to kind of set this as a backdrop, because so much of what happened has to do with the Prime Minister and his attitude towards the convoy, the disdain. And she says, you have a quote here from her memoir, Indian in the Cabinet. And she says these lines from her memoir, you say, haunted me. He asked if I trusted him. This is Jody Wilson-Raybould talking about a conversation with Justin Trudeau. He asked if I trusted him. I could see the agitation visibly building in the Prime Minister. His mood was shifting. I remember seeing it. I remember feeling it. I had seen and felt this before on a few occasions when he would get frustrated and angry, but this was different. He became strident and disputed everything I had said. He made it clear that everyone in his office was telling the truth and that I and others were not. He told me I had not experienced what I had said. He said that line that would later become public, that I had, quote, experienced things differently. I knew what he was really asking, what he was saying. In that moment, I knew what he wanted me to do, to attest that what had occurred had not occurred. And I really thought that was brilliant that you quoted that, because in a real sense, that applies to almost everything that we know and have come to know about Justin Trudeau, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly is. I quoted that because I'm writing the book not just for people that from day one were supporting the Freedom Convoy, but I'm also, and people who were will I think will find my book. I know it'll speak to them, but as well, I'm trying to speak to and write to people who are willing to revisit what happened. Right. And to consider it. And I think that citing Jody Wilson-Raybould's memoir and her experience with Justin Trudeau over the SNC-Lavalin scandal is helpful, because it gives us a window into the character that's governing the country.
Character is a great term, and a kind one. So let's talk about the book. And I mentioned the table of contents, so I'm going to go through this kind of bit by bit. And the first one is an interesting topic that really no one else has yet addressed, and that is chapter 1. Is this a protest or an insurrection? It's a great question. What was the answer that you found?
Well, I asked the question because the protest was being depicted as an insurrection. People like Ottawa City Councillor Diane Deans referring to the protesters as insurrectionists, mercenaries, similar kind of language by numbers of cabinet ministers in the Liberal cabinet, and Trump supporters, and all of everything but the kitchen sink was being thrown at them, and to listen to the testimony by police and intelligence officials at the Public Order Emergency Commission, who were describing the protest. I think it's Patrick Morris, who was the Ontario Provincial Police intelligence officer, who described the protest as not this family-friendly event, not dangerous to a passerby, and who expressed his astonishment and concern with the. He was one of the people providing the raw intelligence, having variously undercover officers walk amongst the crowd, the protesters in Ottawa, as well as the plainclothes police, getting back to his team, and he would write the report describing a situation where politicians could have been reassured that this is not, that there is not a criminal element here, These are not people with criminal records. Nobody has, anything regarding terrorist activity or anything. So lots of reason to say, we can relax. Yes, we got the honking of horns settled by a provincial judge, McLean, on the 7th of February for all intents and purposes, stop the honking, which he was satisfied happened subsequently. But then you have politicians turn around, take that intelligence information, and then run to the press and go 180 degrees in the opposite direction, describing the protesters in the most catastrophizing, alarmist ways. I mean, and so that's why it wasn't an insurrection, but you have the talking points. And I have numerous friends out here, in the west coast of Vancouver, who are saturated with the CBC news, never suspecting that maybe it's changed a little bit if they ever happen to wander into Marianne Clowak, CBC reporter for 34 years, testimony at the National Citizens Inquiry showing how there was a real sea change in how this story was being reported. But they don't suspect it. That there's, they go to the CBC or CTV or Global as their trusted news source that surely has got it right. And so on its face, and I would be back in the social bubble time, be meeting with friends over a coffee or a walk or a lunch at a cafe, and they would be exploding in anger and upset based on all of the things they were hearing, weapons in the trucks, burning down apartment buildings, arson, and so on. And for them, and for quite a lot of them to this day, they're still having all of those scary headlines rattling around inside of themselves, not questioning that any of those headlines could have been hearsay evidence or half-truths or flat out fabrications. And so for that part of our population today, all of those initial headlines are still the capital T truth. And thankfully for me, and I'm somebody who my dad was a dentist. The people, we went to the Point Grey Golf and Country Club. The people that my parents socialized mostly were variously in the medical dental building, doctors, surgeons, chiropractors, and so on. So that's the milieu I grew up in. And I only have one friend who's a truck driver who lives down in Portland, Oregon, who comes up to the folk festival in Vancouver every year or three. So my orientation from growing up in the west side of Vancouver would not predispose me to be sympathetic to truck drivers, partly because I don't know any I don't have friends that I phone up and call and say, how was your day? And they say, well, I drove from Vancouver to Calgary and back. But nonetheless, I became quite puzzled and then suspicious of the and once the Emergencies Act was invoked, I thought there's something really wrong with this. And so I got to follow Rupa Subramanya with her columns on the National Post and see Viva Fry's streamlining and other things that helped me to correct the story of record. But not every one of us is doing a deep dive to say, did that really happen? Did protesters who were being given buckets of food from all over the place by local Ottawa residents coming to the protest, who had, giving them lots of food, or going to restaurants with their own, credit cards and sitting down to a meal, were they stealing, food from the homeless and so on? Unless you look under those rocks and see that really happened. But a lot of people, after all that was going on in the pandemic and the messaging that was happening, have wanted to believe from the get-go that all of these terrible stories must be true. And it's like Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 10 commandments of how bad the protesters were, and that's what must be believed forever and a day.
This suppression of truth around what happened at the convoy is something that I think offends Canadians perhaps as much or more than anything else about what happened. I wonder, you mentioned being out in the West Coast. A friend of mine, Jonathan Bauer, who organizes the We Unify conference, and in fact is where I met Rodney Palmer, who wrote the foreword to your book. He said that there was a sympathetic protest in Victoria going on at the same time. And I had heard nothing about that. Did you hear about this, about another one that was going on in Victoria around at the same time as the one in Ottawa?
I don't remember if I did. I know that there was a sympathetic protest reported actually on CBC on the 23rd of February, no, 23rd of January 2022, as protest vehicles were rolling through. I think it was Salmon Arm.
Okay.
And the report in the news, the print news, was that it was, that everything was pretty peaceful and they're all behaving themselves and so on. Now that started to change very rapidly days later. I ended up I had to take computer to get some tech help at an Apple store. It happened to be on the 5th of February 2022, and I don't have a TV, so I just get my news otherwise. But there was a protest going on in sympathy with what was happening in Ottawa, and so there's honking trucks and so on. And I wasn't sure because I'd heard a lot of people talking about how awful the protesters were in Ottawa. So I was thinking, well, do I need to be concerned walking through this crowd? What's it like? And it happened that I walking down Robson Street, there happened to be a stage. And a woman named Anita Krishna, who's an Indo-Canadian, a woman who had recently been fired from her job. She used to be the director at Global TV out in the West Coast, doing, with, the news. And she talked about how, to all the people in the audience, you see what's happening here today? This will not be reported on the news tonight. And I thought that was very interesting. So that was my firsthand experience, my only experience with a protest.
Interesting. So another thing that you addressed in the book, and this is in chapter 2, is a question that frankly has rarely been asked, but I think is important. You address what sparked the protest, and there's people have some ideas that are maybe obvious surface level, but you go into greater depth. You want to explain about that? What exactly started the Freedom Convoy? How did it get going?
It began because of truck drivers who learned around the 15th of January. I mean, there was a sign from the federal government as far back as late November that they were going to require vaccination or quarantine for, I don't remember if it's 10 or 14 days, but either way, for a truck driver entering Canada, that would be your option. And so there was some pushback from some sectors of the trucking industry, but nevertheless, our federal government barreled ahead and went with it. Now, there was some similar designs on the U.S. side. However, that got changed because of I think a Supreme Court ruling, and so anybody who was involved in any kind of trucking company that was less than 100 people were not affected at all going into the U.S. And I think that even the Supreme Court tossed out the requirements. So then Canada alone, you have people entering Canada. Now, as a truck driver, I mean, in section 6 or 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we have a right to earn a livelihood.
Right.
And so if you're vaccinated, if you're not vaccinated, you can't carry on. If you go with the rules now that are in place, which is to be quarantined for 10 or 14 days, I mean, 30 days in a month, at most you're going to have 2 to 3 days a month to make a living, and that's not enough to pay the monthly bills. Right. So this is what led truck drivers and other citizens, sympathetic, doctors, nurses, people from all walks of life and all races to go to Ottawa to protest what really seemed to be a peculiar exception, because even though you had some very draconian measures, I think in Austria they were going to force all the unvaccinated people to stay in your home, or else you'll be fined the equivalent of like 5,000 Canadian dollars per infraction. but even, but across Europe, people who were driving trucks, because it was seen as, maintaining this, the supply of goods across Europe. You could drive a truck all across from the Netherlands to Greece and so on, and the same up and down South America, and so you have this. It seemed like we were almost a testing ground to see how far governments could go. So that led to that sparked the protest.
Yeah. And these truckers originally were regarded as heroes, keeping the supply chain going and making sure that the food got to the grocery stores and so on. But we had a famous trucker on the show, Chris Barber, and we asked him the question, what did you think was going to happen once you got to Ottawa? And his answer was very frank. He said, I just didn't know. Once we got there, we weren't sure what we were going to do. And then what developed, and this is where I want to go next, is this what you call the growing counter narrative and these comments made by public figures and media that were not premised in fact. You want to talk about that a little bit, about how that developed and why?
Well, there was this message coming out, like the CBC reported that had it not been for Vladimir Putin or Russian actors, nobody would have been inspired to head off to Ottawa in the first place, or that they were all white supremacist, or that they represented a January 6th North. So there was all this alarmist reporting, which scared many Ottawa citizens and many people from coast to coast about who are these awful people. And so there were, thankfully, people like Rupa Subramanya, Viva Fry, Anna Farrow with, I think it's the Catholic Register in Montreal, and a number of other, people who were filming. I mean, Rodney Palmer, who we've spoken of, who had a long, several decades in the media business, was asked as a volunteer to come and do some videotaping for the first 5 days of the protests, and describes it as kind of like a Canada Day in the winter. I mean, just the joy, the elation, the friendliness, people, who are total strangers, just, somebody from Quebec, someone from Alberta, somebody from Prince Edward Island, someone from Manitoba, embracing and everything. And so the whole depiction of what was happening in real time. I mean, Anna Farrow talks about being there with an Afro-Canadian friend of hers who was originally from the Caribbean or has Caribbean roots, and witnessing what they did, the joy, the peacefulness, the safety for them as women walking around. There was no sexual assault, no misogyny that they encountered. But then Anna Farrow looked at her cell phone to see some of the news and how they were all being depicted as racist. And so for her Afro-Canadian friend, it was just horrifying, And so it was really important that people who were there in person, and I think that from what I can tell, for many people who were in Ottawa, if they came down like this, there was this one Afro-Canadian young man, I think probably in his 30s, who was involved in staffing at a fitness club in downtown Ottawa. And his mother, who was watching CTV News each night, was quite worried and concerned for her son. And he said, he'd been into the crowd many times. He said, "No, Mom, it's really quite all right. Why don't you come down with me and you can see for yourself? And if you feel the least bit anxious or concerned, we'll leave right away." So she came down with his mother. They walked around for several hours, and they said, "So what do you think?" And she said, "I don't understand what they're saying on the news. These people are so friendly." So it was really important to have these different accounts, in-person accounts, to combat the messaging on the mainstream media.
And then what grew out of that is, at some point, the government of Canada decides that the threshold for the Emergencies Act reached a point where it was a quote-unquote threat to national security. How and at what point did that come about?
Well, it came about, I mean, from some of the notes in Bill Blair's cabinet. Mr. Blair was under his cross-examination at the Public Order Emergency Commission as early as the 4th of February. It seems that it was invoking the Emergencies Act was in the cards, and then when Prime Minister Trudeau was cross-examined by one of the POEC commission staff, when he was asked, when did they think about invoking the Emergencies Act, and he said, in part, from the very beginning, it was always kind of on the table.
Yeah.
So I think that the emergencies, I mean, the protesters had been. They'd arrived, some arrived the 28th of January, but most arrived 29th of January. And by the weekend of the 12th, 11th, 12th, 13th, protest leaders were in negotiations with City of Ottawa staffers, and they had agreed that 75% of the vehicles would leave the city by the end of the 16th of February. And by noon on the 14th of February, on Valentine's Day, over 100 vehicles had left the city, and city staff had taken photos of the license plates to say, here's another one that's gone. Some were moved out to Wellington Street, but most of them were leaving. And each one, they couldn't all leave at once because many of them are blocked in. But
Right.
Nonetheless, so this is rolling out, and then suddenly the message is put out by someone on social media that the agreement has fallen apart, even though they were proceeding. And then police were not letting the trucks continue to and then the government decided, well, it's a threat to national security because it's harming the economy. Now this is very ironic because the pandemic measures and the lockdowns. I think that Statistics Canada had, by the end of 2020, 120,000 small businesses went bankrupt.
Right.
That harmed the economy. But that was one of the reasons. The other was that there were protests in different places. There was the alarmist suggestion that the vehicles in Ottawa all had weapons in them. The deputy clerk of the Privy Council, Natalie Duran, who is now, I think she's the new National Security Advisor of the Prime Minister, but at the time she was deputy Privy Council person, and she was saying that the protesters were using their children as human shields, and so,
right. I remember
all of
this.
this kind of thing. So it was we have to close it down because the protesters in Ottawa want to overthrow the government. They're burning down apartment buildings. They're being violent, although not a single person was in Ottawa threw a punch, kicked anybody. There's nobody who was ever actually arrested for physical violence. No shop window was broken. So nobody was arrested for looting or theft of property. But nonetheless, there would be this kind of Jody Thomas, who was the National Security Advisor for the Prime Minister at the time, was pressed in her testimony, and she said, "Well, there was pollution," and what do you mean? well, I mean, there were diesel trucks that were running. Now, this is in the context of a country where we've had at times, dozens and dozens, if not over 100 First Nations reserves at different points in the last 50 years that have had no clean and safe water to drink. That's pollution, but
right.
Nonetheless. So yeah.
Priorities. Based on your research, Ray, do you think it's going too far to say that the federal government was looking for an opportunity to invoke this Emergencies Act just to see if they could use these powers and what that would be like if they did?
That's an interesting question. So I'll answer it this way. When the pandemic began in March of 2020, provinces and territories had their own emergencies, or they had their public health orders.
Right.
To, stay at home, wear a mask, social distancing, so on. And at that point, by the third week in March 2020, we seem to be doing fine if you go back and look at the news at that point, in any event. And so nonetheless, the Prime Minister brought up the idea with the leaders, the premiers of the provinces and leaders of the territories, that that he should invoke the Emergencies Act. And at the time, there was pushback from everyone from John Horgan in British Columbia out to the Atlantic coast. So it was a no-go. But it's really interesting that the Prime Minister was eager and interested to invoke the Emergencies Act as early as late March, early April of 2020. So that kind of example would lend itself to the suggestion that the government was interested in using this extreme measure and test it out on the Canadian population.
Yeah, and along those lines, thinking along those lines, at some point they decided that they were going to expand the definition of what is a threat to national security. Do you want to explain about that a little bit? That's covered in Chapter 8 of your book.
So we have, the Emergencies Act stipulates that a national emergency would be triggered because of acts of sabotage, espionage, actual serious violence, and anyway, I'm forgetting the fourth one. But in any event, there are 4 triggers, and the CSIS director David Vigneault went over all 4. When it came to serious violence, he said, they didn't even, CSIS didn't even look at this as seriously, because it was so not a threat, just wasn't happening. So, but then if you wordsmith things enough, if you say, well, a national threat can be, pollution, or a national threat can be harm to the economy some way, even though Statistics Canada found that in February of 2022, actually the health of the economy was stronger by all measures than the previous year, and there was very little, it was more of an upside than anything else. But they're trying to, there's nothing in the Emergencies Act that says if there's an economic downturn caused by somebody. In 2020, from early January of 2020 into mid-March, there were protests in relation to environment and Indigenous issues. The freight and passenger rail services were shut down for 4 or 5 weeks. Highway in Ontario, intermittently passenger ferry service from Vancouver to Victoria and other islands were all impaired. And there was even rail lines that were, junction boxes that were vandalized and so on. And that went on for 12 weeks or so. And the Prime Minister's attitude throughout all of that was, well, we have to have dialogue. We need to understand these people. So, that if economics is a reason, that whole protest in early 2020 would have been a case study in why you would invoke the Emergencies Act, but it wasn't, because economic reasons are not part of the reason to do it.
And so ultimately, what it turns into is a violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in Chapter 10 of your book, you talk about vaccine mandates and Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You want to explain how those fit together and how they became part of the whole Freedom Convoy experience.
So with the vaccine mandates, and people have a right to bodily autonomy, and the vaccine mandates clearly violated that, as did firing people from their jobs, not allowing them to receive employment insurance, what they've been paying into for years and decades. Also restricting freedom of movement based on a non-sterilizing vaccine that as early as by the 6th of August 2021, across the border, the Center for Disease Control director at the time, Rochelle Walensky, conceded on a CNN show with Wolf Blitzer that the vaccine did not prevent infection and did not prevent transmission, which is why subsequently, when the Center for Disease Control had a huge conference of their own staff who were all vaccinated in the following month or year, they had a huge COVID outbreak. So the insistence on having people take a vaccine that doesn't prevent infection or transmission is a problem. And so so that all of this was violating people's basic rights to livelihood as well.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the federal government actually had an opinion from their Justice Department. I believe this is in 1996, and they asked the question of whether or not they could impose a national vaccine mandate. And their own lawyers told them they couldn't do it because it would violate the charter. So what they did is the next best thing, and that is they made every single federally regulated worker and every worker who worked for a crown corporation subject to a vaccine mandate. And in our country, that amounts to nearly 1 million workers. And that put a great many people out of work. I had the experience of representing many of those people, but that's a bit of a forgotten story. And it leads into the question that you address in chapter 11 of your book, and that is, did the Liberal cabinet actually break the law? And what did you discover there? What's the answer to the question?
Well, the answer to the question eventually gets to, thankfully, a federal court ruling in a few chapters later, where I, after having read the nearly 200-page judicial decision by
that must have been a joy.
well, it was a joy, and also the way things happened. Like, I was intending to have the book all wrapped up by December of 2023 and off to the copy editor, but then out comes the judicial review on the 23rd of January of this year, and I had to write another chapter, and I couldn't just put like two paragraphs and say, oh, by the way, there's been this judicial review. I had to not only write a chapter, but I also had to read the whole decision and then make comments and footnote it and everything. So so that's but yes, there were several sections of the charter that were violated. I think section 8 and section 24, I think, and so you have people's rights. I mean, also the way that they went ahead and froze bank accounts, which is also dealt with. I mean, it's all part of the consequence. Even having Deputy Minister Freeland at one point, while the Emergencies Act was in place, musing about maybe making the freezing of bank accounts permanent, or this could be an ongoing thing for other possible malcontents in the future. So all of that has resulted now in a judicial ruling that the government acted unconstitutionally and illegally, and there is a class action lawsuit by Ed Cornell and others who are suing the government for damages. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to remind the government that you just can't roll over people. And I mean, one of the things that's so interesting, we'll get to the report, but I want to mention that we've had in our history the internment of Japanese Canadians in World War II. We put people, we took all of their assets, their boats, their homes, their businesses, and just took it away and put it on auction, and that all went to the government coffers. And we've had a past prime minister, I think it was Mulroney, that apologized on behalf of Canadians for what we did many decades before, seizing people's property and accounts and so on. And now we have a report that comes out when Justice Paul Rouleau was asked to muse about what does he think about the freezing of bank accounts. He said, well, it's too bad that there were some people that weren't even involved in the protest that got their bank accounts frozen. But anyway, we probably could have gone even further and taken people's boats and businesses and properties. So it's like, we seem to have forgotten our history of what happened to Japanese Canadian citizens in World War II. And it's a different thing, but in terms of the mechanism of the impact on individuals, seizing people's bank accounts, properties is something that we shouldn't be going back to.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. And the reaction to the Mosley decision that you discuss is very, very concerning. I want to come around to that, but you probably discovered, to your horror, that most judges don't write in as riveting a style as you do. In fact, maybe they should take some of your writing classes as an aside. But coming back to this idea of what the government did and whether or not it could be justified, I want to talk about the report. But before we go there, it's important to note that the way that the government of Canada has reacted to the Mosley decision, I think, is really, really disturbing, because rather than recognizing their wrongdoing and adjusting their behavior, which is really the purpose of having a separation of powers in our country, and that's how we preserve freedom. That's how we preserve our form of democracy and the rule of law. Instead, they've doubled down and they've created different forms of legislation, which in fact violate rights even further. Bill C-63 goes further, but the most egregious one is Bill C-293, which actually expands the powers of the federal government to impose things like economic sanctions during pandemic situations, which of course they alone would declare. But I want to talk next about the report itself, which you say you've read and the outcome of that. What were your impressions of the POEC report?
Well, it's so interesting. I mean, the report is authored officially by Justice Paul Rouleau. It
may or may not have been in a conflict of interest.
Well, I mean, he aside from going to that, which could be a long discussion, there was the 6 weeks of witness testimony of 76 witnesses. There was a week following, the first week of December, where there was a panel of people talking about legal matters. And then there was a week of final submissions by all of the different parties who were cross-examining witnesses during the POEC. And so you end up, by mid-December, somebody can start writing the report, which then is finished and given to the government on the 17th of February, which is in like lightning speed, because you have to sift through thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of witness testimony, and also all the supporting documents to sort of understand, is this the right thing we're going to cite here or there? And then you have to copy edit it, and you have to proofread it, and then you have to print it. So there was certainly a big team of people writing, and there's even been some suggestion that perhaps some of it had been written even before they got going. But in any event, one of the things that stands out is you have the conclusion that reluctantly Justice Rouleau says that the government was justified, even though many reasonable people, including me, would disagree. Now, he does it on a number of things that are quite astonishing. You hear the testimony, view the testimony of one police officer after the next, intelligence officials, even CSIS Director Vigneault, describing the protest as not reaching the threshold, as being a family-friendly affair, not a threat to a passerby, and so on. And then, and no violence, explicitly no violence, one police officer after the next. And then you have Rouleau waving away all of that kind of testimony and saying, oh, but there were several Ottawa residents that said that there was violence. One of them said that there was psychological violence. They could still hear, if they sort of closed their eyes, they could still hear the honking of horns all these many months later. Now, And so then we have the word violence, wordsmiths. So violence does not have to mean actual physical violence in the criminal
Right.
code. Violence can now mean psychological violence. Now, what are the implications for the Emergencies Act going forward in future governments if all that's required is for somebody somewhere to feel psychologically violated, or there's some sort of psychological violence?
It's almost thought crime, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very dark road to go down if that's this flimsy basis on which to invoke a national emergency.
Right. One of the things that was really astonishing, and I mentioned this earlier about your book, is the sheer volume of material that you went through in your research. How long did it take you to write this book and to go through all of this documentation? That's part one of the question. And secondly, did you have trouble getting your hands on some of the important documents that you wanted to see in order to write the book?
Well, I mean, I began writing the book by April of 2023, when after I'd written about a 7,000 word piece on Covert Action magazine in late February. And even though I had 7,000 words, it wasn't as though I could just sort of plop that whole article into a book. I had to drop things that I'd included and add other things. But at least I had some sort of a spine for what I was going to start writing about. But then I had to go looking for other other news articles about, say, how did the news cover all that they were covering throughout the convoy protests in Ottawa and in Coutts and Windsor. And the challenge always is that, I mean, I can go and do a Google search and I might get a bunch of useful articles that are still there. And sometimes I'll go to a oops, page not found. And but I also don't know what else that I didn't see because it didn't appear on 5 pages of Google. So I mean, there could be some other great article out there that I never got to read because I didn't know it was printed in a Sarnia paper or a Moose Jaw paper or whatever it is. But that's part of it. Then, I mean, the good thing is that the Public Order Emergency Commission has all of the 76 witnesses, the transcripts of what they said, plus the video still available on the POEC website. So I could go there and I'd have to go scrolling away to find out where did Janice Charest, clerk of the Privy Council, say X, Y, Z, and I'd have to go and make sure I had the right quote from the right page from the PDF document. But at least I could go and do that. There's also, I mean, there's sometimes relying on a report in the news, what the news will tell me and what more I could have said is not quite the same. For example, I write down that after, I mean, another thing that happened in delaying the book coming out was that Jerry Morin and Chris Lysak, who were part of the named Coutts 4, were released suddenly on minor firearms charges on the 6th of February of this year. So then I had to, rewrite and do some more things with that chapter. At the time, all I knew was sort of the way the coverage was, minor weapons charges, handgun, shouldn't have been, in an unlocked closet or whatever it happened to be. Now I know if I was going to rewrite that, I would say, well, and actually Jerry Morin was charged with conspiracy to traffic firearms. Not that he ever brought any firearms to Coutts, even though he was traveling west from Calgary in the noon hour on the 14th of February to do some work on a ranch. But I could have spent a few more sentences describing exactly what, so there's things like that I haven't caught. And I imagine that, there are a number of things that are still ongoing with the book. First is that there's been a sentencing and a verdict and a sentencing of the Coutts 2, and there's, I think, appeals are going to be in the mix. And so what will happen with those? There's also the 45th day of the Tamara Litch, Chris Barber trial has happened, but there will be a judgment that's written and a verdict given sometime in winter, spring of 2025. There's also this appeal of the judicial review, and where will that go? And
Right.
will that even go to the Supreme Court? When all of those three things are wrapped up, it may be appropriate for me to write a second edition of the book in 2026 or something like that. And to tie those, I'll call them loose ends together, to complete the chronology of this particular story.
Well, I hope you do. I mean, the Coutts trial alone would be, sufficient fodder for an excellent book. But when you piece all this together, as you do in the book, you come to some interesting impressions about how the Freedom Convoy impacts the fate of democracy, not only in Canada, but also globally. And what are some of those impressions that you're left with?
Well, I think that democracy is fragile. I mean, it's most resilient when there's an arm's length relationship between the media and the government. And right now we have many media outlets, I think over 1,000, who are depending on significant funding from the government. And so, whether it's groupthink or an instinctive, I don't want to bite the hand that feeds me, people will write their stories and report their stories in a way that's a softball coverage of what the government's doing, and harder on those that the government's criticizing. And, and I mentioned this, of course, in the book, that when we had in China, there was Tiananmen Square, there was the coverage of Voice of America and other independent, I think some voices in Hong Kong were describing the protesters as students that wanted more liberalization in China. But if you followed the state media and newspaper, radio, and TV in China at the time, the protesters would be being described as criminals, ruffians, and anarchists who hated China, foreign, influenced, and so on, and not students at all. And so I remember when I learned that some years ago, I remember thinking, well, isn't it great I live in a country like Canada where, our media would never beat up on protesters and depict them in a way that's slanted or fabricated full on. Well, surprise, surprise.
Careful what you wish for. Well, this has been a great conversation. We've learned so much about the book. This book we've been talking about is called Unjustified, the Freedom Convoy, the Emergencies Act, and the Inquiry That Got It Wrong. The Amazon description is that in January of 2022, protesters traveled to Ottawa seeking to debate the Canadian government's pandemic measures that had caused widespread bankruptcies, suicides, domestic abuse, addictions, and overdoses. They challenged the alarmist depiction of the virus as a clear and present danger to all. Media and politicians, as we've heard from our guest, smeared the protesters as insurrectionists, homophobes, Nazis, anti-vaxxers, and arsonists. But was any of that true? Well, here, the author, Ray McGinnis, he examines the testimony at the Public Order Emergency Commission that confirms the protesters were never dangerous as depicted, and he chronicles court cases unfolding since the protests that raised questions about our judicial system. It details a recent federal court ruling that concluded the Emergencies Act invocation was unconstitutional and therefore illegal. So this book is a call to readers to revisit assumptions about what happened at the Freedom Convoy. And Ray invites us to question who benefits when media narratives are scaring us to death, and what is the cost to our democracy. I want to mention, and I want to get you to comment on this, Ray, because the last time you were on, we talked about your previous book, Unanswered Questions, What the September 11th Families Asked and the 9/11 Commission Ignored. Your new book seems to be a great companion piece to that one, because in a lot of ways, your previous book was a precursor, because there you spent a lot of time talking about a different commission, that is the commission to what happened in 9/11. But there seemed to be a lot of themes that carry forward. There's a lot of characteristic features of these commissions that sort of explain how these work and raise some concerns about them. Do you want to talk about that, or would you agree with that characterization that that your previous book is something of a companion piece to the new one?
I think so, because well, I think the families of the victims of 9/11 who forced the whole 9/11 commission to happen in the first place, who provided the government with the commission with over 1,000 questions to ask key witnesses in different departments federally. They said that Lori Van Auken, Mindy Kleinberg, and Kristen Breitweiser, for example, said that they felt that the whole way that the 9/11 Commission was run was political theater. They thought of it as a whitewash and a cover-up, and that you can't get to the truth if you don't ask the questions. I mean, if you have 5 minutes to ask a witness some key questions about what their role is, you don't spend part of the time saying, "I love your hairdo. That's a great pantsuit." And so I mean, and you can imagine someone whose husband has died, and they're sitting there hoping that the commissioner is going to ask some tough questions, and you get this flattery or softball questions coming instead. And so, it seemed that there was, from the perspective of numbers of the families, that the whole 9/11 Commission was run in a way that the report would not find anything that would damage the sitting president's reelection chances. Now, in fairness to the POEC and the Emergencies Act, we have, much of the 9/11 Commission documentation, much of what happened was behind closed doors because it was classified, and and much of it still is. With the POEC, at least we can, if we want to bother to, we can read through the whole report. We can see it. I mean, there was a report from the 9/11 Commission as well, but we can also scroll through all of the 76 witnesses in PDFs and see what they said, and so it's more transparent. But what even Commissioner Rouleau concedes was that time was an enemy. The government waited until the end of the 2-month time that was the outside of when they had to declare that there would be an inquiry. So that's now the 23rd or 24th of April, and then it takes time for a new commission to hire their many dozens of staff, and then decide what questions they want to ask, who will the witnesses be, and as it happens, they didn't finish until mid-December with the final submissions by lawyers. And then they have this deadline by, around the 20th or 23rd of February 2023 to submit a whole report. Well, you can't, so they ended up not hearing people like Brian Peckford, who's one of the people who signed the Charter of Rights and Freedom. So I mean, in my recommendations, in my conclusion, I say that what there should be, God forbid that there ever have to be another Emergencies Act declared, any future inquiry, when they're mandated to go off and investigate, they should have a mandate to, I guess I'll have to change the legislation so that a year after the incident happens, they simply have to provide an interim report. Because some people may not remember, but after the FLQ crisis in 1970, eventually there was the McDonald Commission that looked into RCMP and other things that went on with the government. And they had 4 years until from 1977 to 81 to investigate that. And so, I bet that there could be a case to be made that there still should be an ongoing POAC to this day to look into all of what happened.
I couldn't agree more. I think especially it needs to look into the way that the pandemic was handled by our elected officials, by the people who are governing us. But the previous book, folks, if you're interested, is called Unanswered Questions, What the September 11th Families Asked and the 9/11 Commission Ignored. That book is available on Amazon. And the book we've been talking about today is called Unjustified. I have my copy. I've read it. It's wonderful. It's, as I said, it's the best thing I've yet read about the Freedom Convoy. Unjustified, the Freedom Convoy, the Emergencies Act, and the inquiry that got it wrong. And we've been visiting with the author of these excellent books, Ray McGinnis, a fellow of the Frontier Center for Public Policy. Well, Ray, it's been our tremendous honor and pleasure to have you on the program again. Thanks for coming back to tell us about this new book. I'm certain it's going to be a bestseller, and hopefully we've helped our viewers and listeners to gain awareness about it, and that they'll be motivated to go out and buy it and also share news about it with their friends, because I think this is a very important historical work and piece of commentary, political commentary, for all Canadians who live through this really unique experience, which continues to impact all of our lives. I think it's important to realize that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the Freedom Convoy, it really is not over, is it?
No. And actually, I met with someone yesterday who's just ordering it, and they're going to give it to one of their family members as a Christmas present. It's just an idea in case anybody wants to do that.
Yeah, great idea.
Provocative, but also, and when it comes to the whole heart of the message around Christmas, and the truth will set you free, is part of what Jesus of Nazareth has to say to the world. So, I hope that my book helps people have lively discussions about what is true and what is not true about what happened here in Canada.
Yes, it's a great book, Ray. I really enjoyed it. I have to tell you honestly, though, my favorite book of yours is still the one that is the Psalm-inspired path to writing and appreciating poetry. I love that book. But I'm speaking as an English major. But anyway, thanks so much for being with us. God bless you and all of your work, and we wish you tremendous success with your latest book. It's called Unjustified, folks. It's available now. Check it out on Amazon, any place you buy books. And again, we want to thank you so much, Ray, for being our special guest here today on Grey Matter.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.